They say when something watches you from the dark, it's usually your fear looking back. But that night, Daniel Mercer realized some places remember before you even arrive. The shack stood at the edge of a forgotten stretch of land just outside a town that had long since stopped caring about its borders. A sagging structure of gray wood and rusted nails leaning slightly to the left as if it had grown tired of standing on its own. It was all that remained after the divorce papers were signed, the only thing his name was still attached to, passed to him not as a gift, but as something no one else wanted. Daniel parked his old pickup 20 feet away, the engine ticking as it cooled, and sat there for a moment with his hands resting on the wheel, staring at the place like it might disappear if he looked too long. Beside him, Shadow, his 6-year-old German shepherd, didn't move, didn't pant, didn't shift like he usually did after a long drive. The dog was still, ears slightly forward, eyes fixed on the shack as if listening to something that hadn't yet reached human ears. The wind rolled across the open land in slow, cold waves, carrying the dry scent of dust and old wood, brushing against the truck in soft, uneven breaths. Daniel finally stepped out, boots crunching over gravel, the sound echoing more than it should have in the empty space, and Shadow followed close, his paws landing quieter, more deliberate. The front door of the shack hung uneven on its hinges, a narrow gap revealing darkness inside, and when Daniel pushed it open, it creaked in a long, tired groan that seemed to stretch through the structure itself. The air inside was stale, thick with the smell of damp wood and something older, something settled deep into the walls over years of silence. Faint light filtered through a cracked window, laying pale strips across the warped floorboards, and for a moment, Daniel just stood there, letting the quiet settle around him. He had been in places like this before, abandoned buildings during his service, structures that looked empty but carried a weight you couldn't quite explain. Shadow stepped in ahead of him, nails clicking softly against the wood then, stopping abruptly near the center of the room. His head tilted slightly, ears rising higher, body stiff but not alarmed, as if he was trying to understand something rather than react to it. Daniel set his duffel bag down near the wall, brushing dust off an old wooden table that leaned crooked in the corner, and exhaled slowly. This was it now. No house in the suburbs. No shared furniture. No voice in the next room. Just a shack that looked like it had been forgotten on purpose. He moved toward the small back window, pushing it open an inch to let in fresh air, and the breeze slipped through, carrying a faint metallic tang that didn't belong to the dry land outside. Shadow let out a low, almost inaudible whine. Daniel turned. The dog hadn't moved from his spot. He was staring down at the floor, one paw slightly lifted, hovering over a specific plank as if unsure whether to touch it. "What is it, boy?" Daniel asked quietly, his voice sounding smaller in the empty room. Shadow didn't bark. He didn't growl. Instead, he lowered his head slowly, pressing his ear close to the wood. Daniel felt something shift in his chest, a subtle tightening, the kind that came from instinct rather than thought. He stepped closer, each footfall careful now, the old boards responding with faint creaks beneath his weight. The plank Shadow was focused on looked no different from the others at first glance, just another worn piece of wood faded by time. But as Daniel crouched down, he noticed the edges were slightly uneven, the nails not driven as deep as the rest, as if someone had lifted it once and then tried to put it back without drawing attention. He ran his fingers along the seam, feeling the rough grain under his skin, and for a second, the room seemed to grow quieter, the wind outside fading into something distant. Shadow raised his head and looked at him, amber eyes steady, not afraid, just certain. Daniel swallowed, his hand resting flat against the board now, and he could have sworn, just for a moment, that there was something beneath it, not movement exactly, but a presence, a faint suggestion that the ground below this broken shack was not as empty as it seemed. He exhaled. Slowly, almost a whisper to himself. "Guess we're not as alone out here as I thought." And somewhere in that silence, the shack seemed to listen back. Daniel did not move his hand from the plank right away, as if lifting it too quickly might break whatever fragile truth was beginning to surface beneath it, and for a long moment he simply knelt there with Shadow watching him, the silence in the shack settling into something heavier than before, something that carried a quiet expectation. The wind slipped through the cracked window again, brushing across the floor, and this time it seemed to pause at that very spot, circling faintly before fading, as if even the air recognized that something beneath the wood did not belong to the present. Daniel finally shifted his weight and pressed down gently on one edge of the plank, testing it, and it gave just slightly, not enough to open, but enough to confirm what his instincts had already begun to tell him. It had been moved before. Not recently, but not sealed the way the rest of the floor had been left to age and settle. Shadow stepped closer, lowering his head again, nose hovering inches above the seam, inhaling slowly, then pausing as if sorting through layers of scent too faint for any human to notice. There was no fear in him, no sign of threat, only focus, the kind of quiet certainty that had once helped them navigate places far more dangerous than this forgotten shack. Daniel reached into his bag and pulled out a small flathead screwdriver, the metal cool in his hand, and slid the tip carefully into the narrow gap between the boards. The wood resisted at first, creaking softly, but then shifted with a dry, reluctant sound that echoed through the room like a whisper that had waited years to be heard. He stopped, listening, his breath held without realizing it, but nothing else moved, nothing else responded, and slowly, he applied a little more pressure. The plank lifted just enough for him to grip it with his fingers, and as he pulled it up, a thin cloud of dust rose into the air, catching the pale light and drifting like something suspended between past and present. Beneath it was darkness, not the shallow kind cast by shadow, but a deeper void that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Daniel leaned closer, resting one hand on the floor for balance, and peered down into the narrow opening. At first he saw nothing, just a confined space no more than a few inches deep, but then his eyes adjusted, and shapes began to form. Not objects exactly, but structure. The ground beneath the shack was not bare dirt the way he had expected. It was reinforced. Metal. Old, worn, but unmistakably placed with intention. A faint, almost invisible line ran beneath the opening, extending beyond the space he had uncovered, suggesting something larger, something that stretched further than this single plank could reveal. Shadow let out another soft sound, not quite a whine, more like recognition, and gently placed his paw on the edge of the opening, careful, controlled, as if he understood that whatever lay beneath was not meant to be disturbed carelessly. Daniel felt that same tightening in his chest again, but it was different now, not uncertainty, but something closer to awareness, the kind that comes when pieces begin to align without fully explaining themselves. He sat back slightly, running a hand over his face, feeling the roughness of stubble against his palm, and looked around the shack once more, seeing it differently now. The crooked table, the leaning walls, the broken window, all of it felt less like neglect and more like a disguise, a surface layer hiding something deliberate underneath. He shifted forward again and widened the opening, lifting another section of wood beside the first, exposing more of the space below. The metal beneath caught the light faintly, dull and aged, with small rivets spaced evenly along its edge. It was not random construction. It was designed. The air that rose from the opening carried that same faint metallic scent he had noticed earlier, stronger now, mixed with something cooler, something that had not been exposed in a very long time. Shadow stepped back slightly, not out of fear, but in a way that gave Daniel space, his eyes never leaving the opening. Daniel rested both hands on the floor and leaned in again, studying the pattern of the metal, tracing the line where it met the surrounding earth, and that was when he noticed it. A seam. Not in the wood above, but in the metal itself. Subtle, nearly invisible, but there. A narrow edge that suggested a boundary, a door or a hatch concealed beneath layers of time and silence. He exhaled slowly, the realization settling into him with a quiet weight that felt both heavy and strangely familiar. This was not an accident. This place had been built to hide something. And somehow, for reasons he could not yet explain, he had been the one left standing above it. Shadow lowered himself to the floor beside him, calm but alert, his breathing steady, his presence grounding in a way that made the unknown feel less distant. Daniel rested his hand briefly on the dog's neck, feeling the warmth beneath his fur, then looked back down into the darkness below. Whatever was hidden under that shack had been waiting a long time. And now, for the first time in years, someone had finally opened the door just enough to let it breathe. Daniel did not rush to open the seam beneath the shack, not because he lacked the tools or the strength, but because something deeper told him that whatever waited below had already endured years of silence, and would not reveal itself all at once, and so he chose patience instead, the same patience that had once kept him alive in places where rushing meant losing more than control. He carefully lowered the loosened planks back into place, not sealing them, just resting them enough to cover the opening, and stood slowly, his knees stiff from the cold floor, his eyes still drawn to that exact spot as if it carried a quiet gravity. Shadow remained beside him, but now his posture had shifted slightly, less tense, more watchful, like a sentinel that had confirmed the presence of something important, and was now waiting for the right moment to act again. The fading light outside stretched longer shadows across the interior of the shack, turning the walls into uneven shapes that seemed to move with the wind, and Daniel realized that night was approaching faster than he had expected. He stepped outside for a moment, drawing in a breath of cold air, the sky above painted in muted shades of orange and gray, the kind of evening that carried stillness rather than peace. The land around the shack was empty in every direction, a wide stretch of dry grass and scattered trees that stood far enough apart to make the silence feel even larger, and for the first time since arriving, Daniel felt the weight of distance, not just from town, but from everything he used to know. He walked a slow circle around the shack, boots pressing into the uneven ground, scanning the area with the same quiet awareness that had never fully left him, and it did not take long before he noticed something that did not fit. Behind the shack, partially hidden beneath a layer of dry weeds and dirt, the ground dipped slightly in a shape too clean to be natural, a faint rectangular outline that mirrored the line he had seen beneath the floor. He crouched down and brushed aside the brittle grass with his hand, exposing more of the surface, and there it was again, the same dull metal, aged and worn but unmistakably part of a larger structure. Shadow approached slowly, nose low, tracing the edges of the shape, then pausing at one corner where the dirt had settled differently, as if it had been disturbed long ago and then left to forget itself. Daniel pressed his palm against the metal and felt the cold seep into his skin, deeper than the evening air, a steady chill that seemed to come from below rather than from the surface. He tapped it lightly with his knuckles, listening, and the sound that came back was hollow, contained, echoing in a way that confirmed what he already suspected. This was not just reinforcement beneath the shack. This was an entrance. He sat back on his heels, looking from the ground behind the shack to the structure itself, connecting the lines in his mind, the hidden seam inside, the metal beneath, the unnatural placement of the building. It had not been built on this spot by accident. It had been placed here to cover something. The realization did not come with fear, but with a strange sense of clarity, as if a question he had not known how to ask was finally beginning to answer itself. Shadow lifted his head and looked out toward the horizon for a moment, ears turning slightly as if catching a distant sound carried by the wind, then returned his attention to Daniel, steady and calm. The sun dipped lower, and the temperature dropped quickly, the kind of cold that crept in without warning, settling into the ground and the air alike. Daniel stood and brushed the dirt from his hands, his mind already shifting from discovery to preparation. Whatever lay beneath that shack was not something to explore in the dark, not without understanding what he was stepping into, and not without the tools to do it right. He returned inside, closing the door behind him, the wood groaning softly as it settled back into place, and moved with quiet efficiency, clearing a small space near the wall, setting down his gear, lighting a small lantern that cast a warm, steady glow against the worn boards. The light softened the room, but it did not remove the sense of depth that now lived beneath the floor, a presence that felt less like a threat and more like a waiting. Shadow lay down near the center of the room, close to the hidden seam, his head resting on his paws, eyes open, not restless, not afraid, simply aware. Daniel sat on the edge of his duffel bag, staring at the floor again, his thoughts moving through possibilities, through memories of structures built for purposes that were never meant to be obvious. He had seen underground spaces before, hidden compartments, reinforced chambers, places designed to protect something or to keep something out of sight. But this felt different. There was no immediate sign of decay beyond time, no collapse, no damage that suggested abandonment in panic. It felt intentional, as if it had been sealed and left with the expectation that one day, someone would find it again. He leaned back slightly, resting his shoulders against the wall, listening to the wind as it moved around the shack, the faint creak of wood, the soft rhythm of shadows breathing, and somewhere beneath it all, so faint it could have been imagined, a subtle, almost imperceptible hum, steady and distant, like something deep below the earth remembering how to exist. Daniel closed his eyes for a brief moment, not to sleep, but to steady himself, and when he opened them again, he knew that whatever waited beneath that floor was no longer just a discovery. It was a path. And for reasons he could not yet explain, it felt like one he had already started walking long before he ever arrived here. The night settled slowly over the land, not as a sudden drop into darkness but as a quiet fading of color, the sky dimming inch by inch until the shack stood alone beneath a wide stretch of deepening gray, and inside, the lantern cast a steady circle of light that seemed almost too small for the weight of what lay beneath the floor. Daniel did not sleep right away. He sat there for a long time, listening, not just with his ears, but with the same quiet awareness that had once helped him sense shifts in places where silence was never truly empty. Shadow remained near the center of the room, exactly where the hidden seam rested beneath the boards, his breathing slow and even, but his eyes never fully closing, as if he understood that this night was not meant for rest. At some point, Daniel leaned forward and removed the planks again, not with urgency, but with intention, exposing the narrow opening once more, the darkness below unchanged, patient, waiting. He set the lantern closer to the edge, angling the light downward, and this time, the glow reached farther, revealing more of the metal surface beneath, the rivets, the seams, and something else he had not noticed before. Faint markings. Not scratches, not damage, but deliberate etchings worn thin by time, lines and symbols that carried structure, purpose, a kind of language that had been left behind without explanation. Daniel narrowed his eyes slightly, leaning closer, tracing one of the marks with his gaze, and something stirred in his memory, not a clear image, but a familiarity, the sense that he had seen something like this before, long ago, in a place where details were never meant to be remembered, only followed. Shadow shifted slightly beside him, then let out a low, steady breath, the kind that was not fear, but recognition, and slowly, he lowered his head again, resting his chin near the edge of the opening as if keeping watch over it. Daniel reached into his bag and pulled out a small flashlight, clicking it on and directing the beam into the gap, the sharper light cutting through the dimness and revealing more of the structure below. The metal surface extended beyond what he could see from this angle, sloping slightly downward, and there, just along the seam he had noticed earlier, was a recessed groove, narrow but precise, running in a straight line that suggested a mechanism rather than simple construction. He exhaled quietly, his breath steady, his thoughts aligning, and without fully realizing it, he placed his fingers along the groove, pressing lightly, testing for movement. At first, nothing happened. Then, almost imperceptibly, there was a shift. Not a loud sound, not a dramatic movement, just a subtle release, like something long held in place had finally loosened its grip. Daniel froze, his hands still resting against the metal, and listened. The shack remained still. The wind outside continued its slow, distant rhythm. But beneath it all, that faint hum returned, clearer now, more defined, as if the structure below had responded to his touch. Shadow lifted his head instantly, ears forward, body alert but not tense, his gaze fixed on the opening. Daniel slowly pulled his hand back and widened the gap between the planks, giving himself more room to see, and as he did, the seam in the metal shifted slightly, just enough to reveal a darker line beneath it, a boundary that had not been visible before. He leaned in again, bringing the flashlight closer, and angled the beam along the edge. There was no doubt now. It was a hatch. Carefully concealed, intentionally sealed, and now, slowly beginning to respond. Daniel sat back for a moment, letting the realization settle fully, feeling the weight of it not as pressure, but as a quiet understanding that whatever this place was, it had not been left behind by accident. He reached out again, this time more deliberate, pressing along the groove with a steadier force, and the response came a little more clearly, a soft internal movement that echoed faintly through the metal, like a distant mechanism remembering how to function. The edge of the hatch lifted just enough to create a narrow gap, and from that gap, a cooler air rose, steady and contained, carrying with it that same metallic scent, now mixed with something else, something older, like a space that had been sealed away from time itself. Shadow stood slowly, stepping closer, but stopping just short of the opening, his posture calm, his tail low, his eyes fixed not on the darkness, but on Daniel, as if waiting for him to decide what came next. Daniel held the flashlight steady, directing the beam into the narrow opening, and for a moment, the light caught something below, not clearly, not fully, but enough to show depth, more than a few inches, more than a shallow compartment. This was not a hiding place for small things. This was a passage. He drew a slow breath, feeling the air fill his lungs, steady, grounding, and as he looked down into that newly revealed space, he understood that the shack above was only ever meant to be the surface. Whatever story this place carried, whatever purpose it had once served, it did not begin in the light. It began below. And now, for the first time in years, it was beginning to open again. Daniel did not force the hatch open all at once, even though the narrow gap now revealed a darkness that clearly went deeper than the shallow space he had first imagined, because something about the way it responded to pressure, the slow release, the steady hum beneath it, suggested that this was not a structure meant to be rushed, but one designed to be entered with care. He shifted his position, placing the lantern closer to the opening while keeping the flashlight steady in his other hand, and pressed again along the groove, firmer this time, following the line as if tracing instructions that had been left for someone patient enough to notice them. The metal responded with another quiet movement, smoother now, more willing, and the hatch lifted a few more inches, enough for the edge to reveal its thickness, nearly 3 inches of reinforced material, built to last, built to hold. A faint current of air rose from below, cooler than the night air inside the shack, steady and controlled, carrying with it a scent that was no longer just metal, but something cleaner beneath it, something preserved. Shadow stepped closer, his body aligned with Daniel's, not crowding him, not pulling away, simply present, his ears forward and his gaze fixed on the opening as if he could see beyond what the light allowed. Daniel angled the flashlight downward again, widening the beam, and this time the light reached farther, revealing the first clear detail of what lay below. Steps. Narrow, metal steps descending into the structure, each one evenly spaced, leading into a space that extended beyond the reach of both lantern and flashlight, the darkness below absorbing the edges of the light without resistance. He held the beam steady, following the line of the steps as far as he could, and felt that same quiet shift inside him, the recognition that this was no accidental cavity, no forgotten storage space. This was a designed entry. A path meant to be used. He drew a slow breath and sat back slightly, considering the space, the structure, the time it must have taken to build something like this beneath a place that looked so deliberately insignificant. The shack above, with its leaning walls and broken window, now felt less like a ruin and more like a cover, something placed to be ignored, to keep attention away from what truly mattered below. Shadow lowered his head again, briefly touching his nose to the edge of the opening, then pulling back just slightly, not in hesitation, but in acknowledgement, as if confirming what Daniel had already begun to understand. This place had a purpose. And it had not lost it. Daniel reached into his bag again and pulled out a pair of gloves, sliding them on slowly, the familiar motion grounding him, steadying his thoughts, and then he adjusted the lantern so that its light fell directly into the opening, casting a warmer glow down the first few steps. The metal reflected it faintly, dull but intact, not rusted through, not broken, just aged, like something that had waited without failing. He rested one hand on the edge of the hatch and leaned forward, listening again, and beneath the quiet of the shack, beneath the soft movement of the wind outside, the hum returned, steady, measured, almost rhythmic, like a system still functioning at a level too low to be obvious, but too consistent to be random. He had heard sounds like that before, not in nature, not in empty places, but in structures that had been built with intention, where silence was never truly absence, but a controlled state. Shadow shifted his weight and sat down beside the opening, his posture calm, his breathing even, his eyes now moving between Daniel and the space below, as if waiting for a decision that only Daniel could make. Daniel looked at the steps again, then at the interior of the shack, the worn boards, the dust, the signs of abandonment that now felt carefully placed, and he realized something that settled into him with quiet certainty. This place had not been left behind. It had been left ready. He adjusted his grip on the flashlight and lowered it slightly, testing how far the beam could reach, watching the light fade gradually as it descended, until it disappeared into the deeper dark. He could not see the bottom. Not yet. But the structure held, the steps remained solid, and the air that rose from below carried no decay, no collapse, only stillness, the kind that comes from something preserved rather than forgotten. He placed his boot carefully onto the first step, not committing his full weight, just testing, and the metal held without a sound, steady beneath him. He paused there, balanced between the known and the unknown, feeling the cool air rising against his face, the quiet hum beneath his feet, and the steady presence of Shadow at his side. Then he looked down once more, into the darkness that had waited beneath this shack for longer than he could measure, and without urgency, without hesitation, he shifted his weight forward and prepared to descend, understanding that whatever lay below was no longer just something he had found. It was something that had been waiting for him to arrive. Daniel placed his full weight onto the first step, and the metal responded with a quiet steadiness that carried no echo of weakness, no warning of age giving way, only the firm acceptance of something built to endure, and as he lowered himself further, the light from the lantern above stretched down with him, thinning with each step until it became a distant glow at his back. The air grew cooler as he descended, not the damp chill of decay, but a controlled cold, steady and even, as if the space below had been sealed in a different time and held there, untouched by the seasons above. Shadow followed close behind, his paws landing with precision, his body aligned with Daniel's movement, neither rushing ahead nor falling behind, his presence as measured as the steps themselves. The narrow stairway continued downward for what felt longer than it should have beneath a structure so small, each step spaced exactly the same, each edge clean, the metal worn only by time, not by neglect. Daniel kept one hand against the side wall as he moved, feeling the smooth surface beneath his glove, noting the absence of roughness, of cracks, of anything that suggested this place had been abandoned carelessly. When his boots finally touched a solid floor, he paused, letting his eyes adjust to the new space as the beam of his flashlight expanded outward. The room below was larger than he had expected, not cavernous, but wide enough to stand comfortably, with a ceiling high enough that he did not need to duck. The walls were lined with the same reinforced metal, curved slightly at the corners, forming a contained structure that felt deliberate, engineered, not improvised. The hum he had heard above was clearer here, still faint, but steady, a low vibration that seemed to come from somewhere deeper within the structure, not loud enough to be intrusive, but present enough to be noticed once you stood still. Shadow stepped off the final stair and moved forward slowly, nose low, taking in the space with quiet attention, then stopping near the center of the room where the floor changed slightly in tone, just enough to suggest that different materials had been used at different times. Daniel swept the flashlight across the walls, and details began to emerge from the shadows. Shelving units built directly into the metal, holding objects that had been left exactly where they belonged, not scattered, not abandoned in haste, but placed with intention. Boxes, sealed and labeled in a handwriting that had faded but not disappeared, tools arranged in careful order, a table positioned against one wall with papers stacked neatly in a corner, their edges still aligned as if waiting to be picked up again. There was no dust coating everything, no thick layer of neglect, only a thin settling that spoke of time passing slowly, evenly, without disruption. He stepped closer to the table, the beam of light focusing on the surface, and reached out, brushing his gloved fingers across the papers. They were dry, intact, preserved in a way that felt unnatural for a place hidden beneath the ground for so long. He lifted the top sheet slightly, angling it toward the light, and saw lines, diagrams, structured markings that carried meaning even before he fully understood them. Shadow let out a soft breath behind him, then moved toward the far side of the room, where a narrow corridor extended deeper into the structure, partially hidden in shadow. He stopped at its entrance and looked back at Daniel, ears forward, waiting, the same way he had done countless times before when he had found something worth following. Daniel set the paper back down carefully, not out of fear, but out of respect for the order that had been left behind, and turned toward the corridor. The hum grew slightly stronger in that direction, not louder, but clearer, as if whatever source produced it was located beyond that passage. He took a slow step forward, then another, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness ahead, revealing a path that continued deeper than the initial room, the walls narrowing slightly, guiding movement in a single direction. Shadow moved ahead this time, just a few feet in front, his pace steady, his body language focused, not cautious, not uncertain, but purposeful, as if he recognized that this place was not random, that it had been built with a path in mind. Daniel followed, his senses sharpening with each step, the air remaining consistent, the temperature steady, the hum maintaining its quiet rhythm, like a system still functioning beneath the surface of everything. Visible. As they reached the midpoint of the corridor, the space began to open again, and the light revealed another chamber ahead, larger than the first, with structures that rose from the floor in shapes that were not immediately clear. Daniel slowed, taking in the outline, the arrangement, the way everything seemed to exist in balance rather than chaos, and he felt that same quiet realization settle deeper within him. This was not just a hidden space. It was a place designed to continue. And whatever purpose it had once served had not been lost. It had simply been waiting, preserved beneath layers of time, until someone willing to listen, to follow, to move carefully, finally stepped down into its silence. Shadow stopped at the threshold of the next chamber, and stood still, his body relaxed but attentive, his gaze fixed forward, and Daniel came to stand beside him, the beam of light stretching into the space ahead, revealing just enough to understand that what they had found was only the beginning. Daniel did not step into the second chamber immediately, even though the path ahead was clear and the space seemed stable, because something about the way the room revealed itself, slowly and without urgency, suggested that it was meant to be understood before it was entered, and so he stood there beside Shadow, letting the light move across the surfaces, letting his eyes adjust to the structure as it came into focus. The chamber was larger than the first by at least twice the width, with a ceiling that arched slightly higher, supported by reinforced beams that blended seamlessly into the walls, and at its center stood a series of tall metal units arranged in precise alignment, each one about 6 feet high and 3 feet wide, spaced evenly as if forming rows in a place that had once been active, not abandoned. The hum that had followed them down the stairway was stronger here, not louder in volume, but deeper in presence, a steady vibration that seemed to come from within the units themselves, like something still functioning at a level just beneath perception. Daniel stepped forward slowly, his boots making soft contact with the floor, and Shadow moved with him. Staying just slightly ahead, his nose lifting now rather than lowering, drawing in the air as if the scent itself had changed. The light from the flashlight swept across the nearest unit, revealing a smooth surface broken only by a narrow vertical panel, and as Daniel angled the beam closer, details began to appear. Small markings, etched into the metal, not worn away but preserved, numbers and letters arranged in sequences that suggested organization rather than decoration. He reached out and brushed his gloved hand across one of them, feeling the faint indentations beneath his fingertips, and for a brief moment, something in his memory aligned again, that same distant familiarity he had felt earlier, like a fragment of training or experience that had never fully left him. Shadow paused beside one of the units and tilted his head slightly, then shifted his gaze toward Daniel, not uncertain, not alarmed, but aware, as if waiting for him to see what the dog had already sensed. Daniel followed that instinct and moved closer, directing the light along the edge of the panel, and that was when he noticed the seam. It was subtle, nearly invisible unless you knew to look for it, but it ran the full height of the unit, suggesting that the surface could open. He hesitated only briefly before placing his hand along the edge, testing it the same way he had tested the hatch above, applying just enough pressure to feel for movement. At first, nothing happened, and then, with a soft internal shift, the panel responded, sliding slightly to the side with a controlled motion that carried no resistance, only precision. Daniel stepped back half a pace, holding the light steady as the panel opened enough to reveal what lay within. The interior of the unit was not empty. It held compartments, each one carefully structured, each one containing objects that had been placed with the same deliberate order he had seen throughout the space. Small cases, sealed containers, documents stored in protective sleeves, and at the center, mounted securely, a device unlike anything he had expected to find. It was compact, no larger than a standard toolbox, but its surface was smooth and unmarked, with a faint glow along one edge, barely visible but unmistakably present. The hum in the room shifted slightly as the panel opened, not increasing, not decreasing, but changing in tone, as if the structure itself had acknowledged the access. Shadow stepped closer, his posture calm, his ears forward, and he let out a soft, steady breath, the kind that carried recognition rather than curiosity. Daniel lowered the flashlight slightly, focusing on the device, studying its shape, the way it was secured, the way it seemed both dormant and active at the same time. He did not reach for it yet. Instead, he looked around the chamber again, taking in the rows of identical units, the consistency of their placement, the absence of disorder, and he understood that this was not a single hidden cache. This was a system. Whatever this place had been, it had been built to store, to protect, to preserve something of value far beyond a single discovery. He turned slowly, scanning the far side of the chamber, and noticed another set of panels along the wall, larger this time, arranged horizontally, each one bearing markings that looked less like labels and more like instructions. The air remained steady, the temperature unchanged, the hum constant, and for a moment, the entire space felt suspended, not in time, but in purpose, as if it had been paused rather than abandoned. Shadow moved toward the far wall, stopping near the larger panels, and glanced back once more, his gaze steady, his presence grounding in a way that made the scale of the discovery feel less overwhelming. Daniel took a slow breath, the kind that settles more than just the body, and stepped forward again, knowing now that whatever lay within this chamber was not just hidden wealth or forgotten storage. It was something designed with intention, something that had waited through years of silence not to be found by chance, but to be opened by someone willing to see beyond what was left on the surface. And as he stood there, the light steady in his hand, the quiet hum surrounding him, he realized that this place had not been forgotten at all. It had been waiting for the right moment to be understood. Daniel moved slowly toward the larger panels along the far wall, the beam of his flashlight steady but his attention shifting beyond the light itself, as if he had begun to sense that this place did not simply reveal itself through sight alone, but through presence, through patience, through the quiet alignment of understanding that came only when a person stopped trying to force meaning and instead allowed it to emerge. The panels were broader than the vertical units, each one stretching nearly 4 feet across, their surfaces marked with engraved lines that formed structured patterns, not random symbols, but something closer to a system of communication, a language designed to guide rather than conceal. He stopped a few feet away, studying them, letting his eyes trace the sequences, and once again that distant familiarity stirred within him, stronger now, no longer just a fragment, but a thread beginning to connect. Shadow stood beside him, his posture relaxed yet attentive, his gaze moving across the panels in the same slow rhythm, as if the dog could feel the intention behind them even without understanding their form. Daniel reached out carefully, placing his gloved hand against one of the engraved sections, and the moment his fingers made contact, the hum in the chamber shifted again, not louder, not sharper, but more focused, as though something had narrowed its attention to that single point of contact. He held his hand there for a moment, not pressing, not moving, just allowing the connection to settle, and then, with a slight adjustment of pressure, he followed the line of one of the engravings, tracing it from left to right. The response was immediate but subtle. A soft internal movement, a faint mechanical alignment, and then a narrow section of the panel slid inward before retracting to the side, revealing a recessed compartment built seamlessly into the wall. The light from his flashlight reached inside, illuminating what lay within, and Daniel felt his breath pause, not in shock, but in recognition. The compartment contained a set of documents, carefully preserved within transparent sleeves, each one labeled with precise handwriting that had not faded, as well as a small metallic case positioned at the center, its surface smooth and unmarked except for a single engraved insignia. He leaned closer, angling the light to see more clearly, and the insignia came into focus, simple in design but unmistakable in meaning, a symbol tied to a division he had once known, a unit that operated in places where records were not meant to exist. The realization did not come as a sudden jolt, but as a quiet confirmation of what had been building since he first stepped inside the shack. This was not just a hidden structure. It was connected to something he had once been part of, something that had been kept out of sight by design. Shadow let out a soft exhale beside him, then lowered his head slightly, not in submission, but in acknowledgement, as if he understood that this moment carried weight beyond the physical space around them. Daniel reached into the compartment and carefully removed one of the documents, holding it under the light, his eyes moving across the lines, the diagrams, the structure notes that detailed systems, locations, and protocols that were never meant for public record. He did not read everything at once. He did not need to. The pattern was clear. This place had been part of a network, a hidden system designed to preserve something critical, something that had been intentionally separated from the surface world. He returned the document to its place and shifted his attention to the metallic case, his hand hovering over it for a moment before he touched it, the cool surface steady beneath his glove. The hum responded again, this time with a slight change in rhythm, as if acknowledging the interaction. He did not open it yet. Instead, he stepped back slightly and looked around the chamber once more, taking in the rows of units, the structured placement, the absence of chaos, and he understood now that the value of this place was not measured in a single object or a hidden sum, but in the system itself, in what it held, in what it preserved. Shadow moved a few steps away, then turned back, his eyes meeting Daniel's, steady and calm, grounding him in the moment. The past and the present seemed to overlap in that space, not in conflict, but in alignment, as if everything that had led Daniel there had not been random, but part of a path he had not recognized until now. He closed the panel gently, the compartment sealing itself with the same quiet precision, and stood there for a moment longer, the hum steady, the air unchanged, the space holding its silence with purpose. And in that silence, Daniel realized something that settled deeper than any discovery he had made so far. He had not just found something hidden beneath a forgotten shack. He had stepped into something that had been waiting specifically for someone who would understand what it was, not just see it. And for the first time since everything in his life had fallen apart, he no longer felt like he had been left with nothing. He felt like he had been led here for a reason he was only beginning to understand. Daniel stood in the quiet after closing the panel, the hum settling back into its steady rhythm as if the chamber itself had accepted his presence, and no longer needed to test it. And for a long moment he did not move, not because he did not know what to do next, but because something deeper within him had finally gone still, the kind of stillness that comes when a question you have carried for years no longer demands an answer. Shadow stepped closer and sat beside him, his body relaxed now, his breathing even, the alert tension that had guided them through each step replaced by a calm certainty, as if the dog understood that the path they had followed had reached the place it was meant to lead. Daniel turned slowly, letting his eyes move across the chamber one more time, taking in the rows of units, the sealed compartments, the preserved order that spoke not of abandonment, but of intention carried forward through time. This place had not been forgotten. It had been protected, held beneath the surface until someone who could recognize its purpose stood inside it again. He walked back toward the first unit they had opened, pausing briefly to look at the device within, the faint glow along its edge still present, steady and unchanged, and he understood now that its value was not something that could be measured in a number or claimed in a moment. It was part of something larger, something that had been built to outlast the people who created it. He reached out and gently slid the panel closed, the movement smooth, the mechanism responding with the same quiet precision, and as it sealed, the hum shifted once more, settling deeper, as if the system had returned to its resting state. Shadow rose and moved toward the corridor without being called, glancing back once, his eyes meeting Daniel's with a simple, steady look that carried no urgency, only direction. Daniel followed, his steps measured, his mind no longer racing to understand, but moving in quiet alignment with what he had already accepted. They walked back through the narrow passage, the walls guiding them upward toward the first chamber, the hum softening as they moved away from its source, until it became once again a distant presence rather than a surrounding one. When they reached the base of the stairway, Daniel paused and looked back one last time into the space below, the darkness now holding meaning rather than mystery, and he understood that what he had found was not something to be taken or emptied, but something to be respected, something to be kept in the same quiet order it had always held. He placed his hand briefly against the wall, feeling the smooth metal beneath his glove, grounding himself in the reality of it, and then he turned and began to climb. Each step carried him back toward the surface, the air growing slightly warmer, the faint light from above widening with each movement, until the opening of the hatch came into view, the lantern still burning where he had left it, its glow steady and unchanged. Shadow moved up ahead this time, emerging into the shack with the same calm certainty, stepping onto the wooden floor as if nothing about the space had changed, even though everything had. Daniel followed, pulling himself up through the opening and standing once more inside the small, worn structure that now felt entirely different from when he had first arrived. The shack no longer felt like the end of something. It felt like the beginning of something he had not yet fully named. He replaced the planks carefully, not sealing them, but setting them back into place with intention, preserving the surface while knowing what lay beneath it. The wind outside had quieted, the night settled into a deep, steady calm, and the faint sound of distant trees moving carried through the open crack of the window. Shadow lay down near the center of the room again, his head resting on his paws, eyes half closed now, no longer watching for something to reveal itself, but simply present in the space they had claimed together. Daniel sat down across from him, his back against the wall, his gaze drifting once more to the floor, but this time not searching, not questioning, only remembering. He had arrived with nothing that felt worth keeping, a life reduced to what could fit into the back of a truck, a place handed to him because it held no value to anyone else. And yet beneath that surface, something had been waiting, something built with care, preserved with intention, something that had outlasted time itself. He exhaled slowly, the breath steady, his shoulders relaxing in a way they had not in years, and in that quiet, he understood something simple and undeniable. Not everything that looks broken is meant to be discarded. Some things are meant to be discovered by those who know how to see beyond what has been left behind. And sometimes, what feels like the end of everything is only the moment when something greater begins to open, quietly, patiently, exactly when it is meant to.